I'm sorry. I think I'm in the wrong room. Annie said it softly, almost afraid the words might echo. She stood just inside the doorway, fingers curled around the thin plastic bag of porridge, the warmth seeping into her palms. The man startled. The photograph slipped from his hands and fell to the floor. For a moment, he just stared at it, as if unsure how it had gotten there. Then he looked up. His eyes met Annie's sharp with surprise, then cautious, then quietly tired. "It's all right," he said. "You scared me. That's all." "I didn't mean to," Annie said quickly. "I was trying to find my mom's room." He nodded, bending to pick up the photograph. When he straightened, he held it a little tighter than before. "Your mom?" "Yes, sir. She's sick." Annie lifted the bag slightly. "I bring her porridge after school. She says hospital food makes people sad." That earned a breath of a smile, not quite a laugh, just enough to change his face. "She might be onto something," he said. Annie relaxed a fraction. "I can go," she offered. "I didn't know anyone was in here." "You can stay a moment," he said, surprising himself. "If you want." She hesitated, then took a small step forward. Her eyes drifted to the photograph in his hand. "Is that your family?" she asked. He followed her gaze. His thumb brushed the edge of the picture. It was. Annie tilted her head. "They look happy." "They were," he said quietly. "My family is just me and my mom," Annie said, as if continuing the conversation where it naturally led. "But we're happy too. Most days." He looked at her again. "What about your dad?" She shook her head. "I only have my mom. It's been like that since I was little." "I see." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. "I used to have everything," he said after a moment. "A wife, a child, a house that felt full." He exhaled slowly. "Then, there was an accident, and after that, it was just me." "That's not fair," Annie said at once. He glanced at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Annie studied the photograph again. "My mom says families don't disappear," she said. "They just change shape." He didn't answer right away. She took another step into the room and set the porridge gently on the small table. Then she slipped her backpack off her shoulders and unzipped it. Inside were pencils, a worn notebook, and a folded piece of paper. "I drew this earlier," she said, carefully unfolding it. "I was going to give it to my mom. But I think you need it too." He watched as she held it out. The drawing showed 3 figures holding hands. A woman in the middle, a man on one side, a child on the other. Above them, a crooked sun filled the corner of the page. "My mom says families don't always look the same," Annie said, "but they still count." He took the paper slowly, as if it might vanish if he moved too fast. His throat tightened. "It's beautiful," he said. "You can keep it," Annie added. "I can draw another one." "Thank you," he said, and meant more than the words could carry. "I'm Daniel." "Annie." They stood there for a moment, the quiet settling differently now. Daniel cleared his throat. "Do you come here every day?" "Yes," Annie said. "After school, I help my mom walk in the hallway when she feels strong enough." "It has not done." He nodded, picturing it. "Would you?" He hesitated, the question feeling strangely important. "Would you visit me too? When you're here?" "I mean," Annie didn't hesitate at all. "Okay." Just like that, he let out a slow breath, something loosening in his chest. "I'd like that." Annie smiled, wide and unguarded. "I should go now. My mom will worry." "Of course," Daniel said. "I'll see you tomorrow then." "Yes," she said, already turning toward the door. Then she paused. "You're not invisible," she added, as if stating a fact, and then she was gone. Daniel sat back down, the drawing in his hands, the photograph beside it. For the first time in a long while, the room didn't feel empty. Annie found her mother's room on the second try. She moved carefully down the hallway, counting doors the way she always did when the signs stopped making sense. When she finally pushed the door open, her mother was awake. sitting up against her pillows, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face softened the moment she saw Annie. "There you are," her mother said. "I was starting to think the porridge had decided to run away with you." Annie smiled and held up the bag. "It tried, but I caught it." She set the porridge down on the small table and climbed onto the chair beside the bed, the way she always did. Her mother watched her closely, eyes lingering just a little longer than necessary, as if memorizing her face. "You're late today," her mother said gently. "The hospital was really crowded," Annie replied. She hesitated, then added, "I went into the wrong room." Her mother's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Did you apologize?" "Yes," Annie said. "He said it was okay. And cod. He? Yeah. A man. He was sick too." Annie stirred the porridge slowly. He was holding a picture of his family. Her mother didn't say anything right away. She took the spoon Annie offered and tasted the porridge. "Was he kind?" "Yes," Annie said without hesitation. "He looked lonely." Her mother met her eyes. "A lot of people here are lonely." "I think so," Annie said. She swung her feet back and forth, the motion absent-minded. "I told him I'd visit him when I come here." Her mother paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. "You did?" he asked, Annie said, and he looked like he really wanted me to say yes. Her mother studied her for a moment, weighing the world the way adults always did, with all its invisible dangers and quiet rules. Then she nodded. "Just don't wander too far," she said, "and always tell me where you're going." "I will," Annie promised. They ate together in comfortable silence. When her mother finished, Annie wiped the container clean with a napkin and tucked it back into the bag. Then she helped her mother swing her legs over the side of the bed. "Do you feel strong enough to walk?" Annie asked. "A little," her mother said. "Just down the hallway." Annie moved slowly, her small arm wrapped carefully around her mother's waist. They stepped into the corridor together, joining the steady flow of people moving in both directions. Her mother leaned on her more than she liked to admit, but Annie didn't mind. It made her feel useful, needed. They hadn't gone far when Annie saw him. Daniel was standing near the window at the end of the hall, one hand resting on the railing, the other tucked into the pocket of his robe. He looked thinner now, she thought, or maybe she was just seeing him more clearly. When he turned and noticed her, his expression changed, the heaviness lifting just a little. He smiled. Annie's heart jumped. She waved before she could stop herself. "That's him," she whispered to her mother. "The man I told you about." Her mother followed her gaze. "The one with the picture?" "Yes." Daniel hesitated, then stepped toward them, moving carefully, as if unsure he was allowed to cross that invisible line between strangers. "Hello," he said. "Annie, right?" "Yes," Annie said proudly. "This is my mom." Her mother extended her hand without thinking. "It's nice to meet you. Thank you for keeping my daughter company." Daniel shook her hand, his grip gentle. "She kept me company," he said. "I didn't realize how much I needed it." They stood there for a moment, an awkward triangle in the middle of the hallway, until Annie broke the silence. "My mom likes to walk after she eats," she said. "The doctor says it helps." Daniel nodded. "That's good advice. I'm supposed to do the same." He glanced down the corridor. "Would you mind if I walked with you?" Her mother smiled, polite and warm. "Of course not." They moved slowly, the three of them keeping pace with one another. Annie walked between them, her hand in her mother's, her steps light. Daniel asked simple questions: how long her mother had been in the hospital, how Annie liked school, what grade she was in. There was no hurry in his voice, no sense that he was performing or pretending. He listened the way people rarely did, with his full attention. "My mom says listening is how you show respect," Annie said when there was a pause. "She's right," Daniel replied. Her mother glanced at him, surprised, then smiled. "Not many people believe that anymore." Daniel shrugged. "I'm learning a lot lately." They reached the window and stopped. Outside, the sky was fading into early evening, the light soft and gray. Cars moved along the street below, their headlights blinking on one by one. "This is my favorite spot," Daniel said. "It reminds me there's a world out there that keeps going." Her mother nodded. "That's important." They stood there quietly, Annie felt something settle around them, something calm and steady. It felt safe. "I should let you rest," her mother said after a while. "We don't want to wear you out." Daniel smiled at Annie. "Will I see you tomorrow?" "Yes," Annie said. "I come every day." He hesitated, then looked at her mother. "Would it be all right if I stopped by sometimes? To talk?" Her mother met his gaze, reading the loneliness there, the sincerity. "That would be fine," she said. "Annie could use more good listeners in her life, and I could use more honest ones," Daniel replied. They said goodbye, and Annie helped her mother back to her room. As she tucked the blanket around her mother's legs, she felt lighter somehow, as if she had done something important without quite understanding why. Later that evening, as Daniel lay back against his pillows, he unfolded Annie's drawing once more. He placed it on the table beside his bed, next to the photograph he had carried for so long. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to turn the picture face down. If this moment touched your heart, take a second to like this video. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. The next afternoon, Annie rushed through her last class with the kind of restless energy her teacher had learned to recognize. Her foot bounced under the desk, her eyes drifting to the clock every few minutes. When the bell finally rang, she was out of her seat before the sound had fully faded. She didn't linger outside the school gates the way some of the other kids did. She adjusted her backpack, waved a quick goodbye to a friend, and started walking. The route was familiar, 3 blocks past the corner store, across the street with the long traffic light, then straight toward the hospital that had begun to feel like a second home. At the small grocery, the owner greeted her with a nod. Annie pointed to the same container of porridge she always bought. He didn't ask why a child came in alone every afternoon. He had learned, like most people in the neighborhood, that some questions were answered simply by showing up every day. By the time Annie reached the hospital, the sky had shifted into a dull blue-gray. Inside, the air felt cooler, heavier. She signed in the way her mother had taught her, careful to copy the letters exactly, then headed toward the elevators. She didn't get lost this time. Her feet slowed as she passed Daniel's room. The door was open. For a second, she hesitated, remembering her promise to tell her mother where she was going. Then she peered inside. Daniel was sitting up in bed, a tray untouched in front of him. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face, quickly followed by something else, relief, maybe. "You came," he said. "I said I would," Annie replied, stepping in. "I just need to tell my mom first." "Of course," he said. "I'll be here." She ran down the hall, breathless by the time she reached her mother's room. "Mom, can I say hi to Daniel first?" she asked. "Just for a little bit." "Acting." Her mother studied her face, then nodded. 10 minutes, then come back." "I will," Annie promised, already backing toward the door. When she returned, Daniel was watching the doorway like he had been afraid she might disappear. "My mom says 10 minutes, Annie announced. Daniel smiled. "Then I'll make them count." She sat on the chair beside his bed, swinging her legs. For a while, they talked about small things. School, the porridge, how the weather couldn't seem to decide what season it was. Daniel listened, asking questions, laughing quietly at her observations. "You notice a lot," he said. "My mom says noticing is how you don't miss important things," Annie replied. "That's a good way to live," he said. After a pause, he asked, "Do you really come here every day?" "Yes," Annie said. "Sometimes twice, if my mom has a bad night." Daniel looked away. "That's a lot for someone your age." Annie shrugged. "She did a lot for me first." He nodded slowly, as if filing that away. When the 10 minutes were almost up, Annie stood. "I have to go." "I know," Daniel said. "But will you come back tomorrow?" "Yes," she said, like it was the easiest thing in the world. That night, Daniel slept better than he had in weeks. Over the next few days, a quiet rhythm formed. Annie came after school. Sometimes she stayed for 5 minutes, sometimes longer, depending on how her mother was feeling. Daniel began to look forward to the sound of her footsteps in the hallway, light and unhurried. The room felt less like a place people passed through, and more like somewhere you could stay. One afternoon, Annie arrived with a new drawing. This one showed a long hallway with doors on both sides. One door was open, light spilling out. "I drew the hospital," she explained. "But the good part," Daniel studied it carefully. "I like that you left the door open." Doors are for going through," Annie said simply. He laughed softly. "You're wiser than most adults I know. I hear that a lot," she said, completely serious. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. A nurse stepped in, glanced at Annie, then at Daniel. "Visiting hours are almost over," she said, not unkindly. Annie stood. "I have to help my mom walk." Daniel nodded. "I'll see you tomorrow." As Annie left, the nurse lingered. "She your granddaughter?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, just a friend." The nurse raised an eyebrow but said nothing as she left. Later that evening, Daniel found himself thinking about that word, friend. He hadn't used it in a long time. Not since his life had split cleanly into before and after. He reached for the photograph again, then stopped. Instead, he picked up Annie's drawing and held it in both hands. For the first time since the accident, the memory didn't crush him. It hurt, yes, but it didn't hollow him out. It reminded him that he had loved once, that he was still capable of it. Down the hall, Annie helped her mother back into bed. "You like him?" her mother said gently. "Yes," Annie replied. "He listens." Her mother smiled, a little sad, a little hopeful. "That's rarer than people think." Annie climbed onto the chair beside her mother's bed, the day finally catching up with her. As her eyes drifted closed, she thought about Daniel sitting alone in his room and felt certain of one thing. He wouldn't be alone for long. By the end of the first week, Annie knew Daniel's room number without looking at the signs. She still checked in with her mother first, still counted doors when the hallway grew confusing, but her feet remembered the way now. After school, after the grocery, after the elevator ride that always felt too slow. Her steps carried her there almost on their own. That afternoon, Daniel was sitting in the chair by the window when Annie arrived. He was fully dressed, shoes on, posture careful, as if he were practicing how to exist outside of a bed again. When he saw her, he stood too quickly, then laughed at himself. "Easy," Annie said. "My mom says rushing makes things worse." "She sounds like a wise woman," Daniel replied, easing back into the chair. "She is," Annie said. "Even when she's tired." Daniel nodded, the words landing somewhere deeper than she knew. "How is she today?" "Better," Annie said. She walked almost to the nurse's station. "That's good," he said. "Progress matters." Annie climbed onto the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb the neatly folded blanket. "They say you might go home soon." He hesitated. "They do." "Is that good or bad?" she asked. Daniel looked out the window. "I'm not sure yet." Annie considered that. "My mom says going home is scary when you don't know if you'll come back the same." Daniel turned to her, surprised. "Did she say that?" "She says a lot of things when she thinks I'm not listening," Annie replied. He smiled, then sighed. "Your mother is right. I've been away from my life for a long time." "Do you have a house?" Annie asked. "Yes." "Is it empty?" The question was gentle, curious, honest. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." Annie frowned. "Empty houses feel sad." "They do," he agreed. She slid off the bed and wandered around the room, studying the small details the way she always did. The untouched tray, the extra chair no one ever sat in, the photograph and her drawing, now placed side by side on the table. "You kept it," she said, pleased. "I did," Daniel replied. "I look at it every morning." "That's good," Annie said. "Pictures help people remember." "Sometimes they hurt," he said. "Sometimes," she agreed. "But my mom says pain means something mattered." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. A soft knock interrupted them. A nurse stepped in, clipboard tucked against her chest. "Mr. Hale," she said, glancing at Annie before returning her attention to him. "You have a physical therapy session in 10 minutes. Daniel nodded. "I'll be ready." The nurse paused. "Your visitor can wait here or head out to the hallway." "I'll go," Annie said immediately. "I have to help my mom anyway." Daniel stood. Will I see you after? Yes, Annie said. I always come back. Oh, he smiled at that, a little steadier than before. Annie found her mother sitting up, reading a worn paperback. She closed it when Annie entered. You look happy, her mother observed. I am, Annie said. Daniel's getting stronger. Her mother watched her carefully. You like him? Yes, Annie said. He feels quiet, like he needs someone to sit with him. Her mother nodded. Some people need permission to not be alone. Annie didn't fully understand that, but she remembered it. When Daniel returned later, moving slowly but with determination, Annie was waiting. They walked together this time, Annie on one side, her mother on the other. Daniel kept his pace measured, respectful, never rushing them. You don't have to walk so slow, Annie said. I want to, Daniel replied. It helps me remember where I am. They reached the window and stopped. Outside, the city hummed, distant and indifferent. I used to think being strong meant never stopping, Daniel said suddenly. Never slowing down, never needing anyone. And now, Annie asked. And now, he said, I think strength might be knowing when to stay. Her mother met his gaze, something like understanding passing between them. That takes courage, she said. Daniel nodded. More than I expected. They stood there until her mother grew tired. As Annie helped her back to her room, Daniel watched them go, the simple tenderness of the moment imprinting itself on him. That evening, after Annie had gone home, Daniel sat alone in his room. The lights dimmed. He thought about the way Annie listened, the way her mother spoke without pretense, the way the hospital no longer felt like a place of waiting, but a place of meeting. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't defined solely by what he had lost. Down the hall, Annie lay in bed, her homework finished, her backpack ready for the morning. She stared at the ceiling and thought about empty houses and quiet rooms. Tomorrow, she decided, she would bring Daniel another drawing. Annie brought the new drawing folded carefully inside her math notebook. She hadn't drawn it the night before, even though she'd planned to. Homework had taken longer than usual, and by the time she finished, her eyes felt heavy. Instead, she woke up early and sat at the small kitchen table while the apartment was still quiet. She used the blue pencil sparingly, the yellow one for light, and pressed extra hard when she drew the people, as if that would make them stay. When she reached the hospital that afternoon, she didn't go straight to Daniel's room. She went to her mother first. Her mother looked tired, more tired than yesterday. The color in her face was thinner, stretched. Annie noticed immediately, the way she always did. You okay? Annie asked, climbing onto the chair beside her. I'm all right, her mother said, but she didn't quite meet Annie's eyes. Just one of those days. Annie nodded. She understood those days too. They sat together quietly for a moment. Then Annie said, I'm going to see Daniel. I'll be right back. Her mother smiled faintly. Don't be long. I won't. Daniel was lying back in bed when Annie entered. Eyes closed, one arm resting across his chest. For a moment she thought he might be asleep. Then his eyes opened. You walk quietly, he said. I try, Annie replied. My mom says quiet feet are polite feet. I like that, he said. He sat up slowly. How's your mother? Not great, Annie admitted. But she'll be okay. Daniel nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair. Annie climbed up, swinging her legs. I brought something, so I see, he said, nodding toward her notebook. She pulled the drawing out and handed it to him without ceremony. This one was different. It showed a hallway with 3 figures walking side by side. One was small, one was taller, and bent slightly. The third stood straight but close, their arm hovering protectively, not touching, but ready. At the end of the hallway was a door, open. Light spilling through. Daniel stared at it for a long time. That's us, he said finally. Yes, Annie said. That's what it's supposed to be. You didn't draw faces, he observed. You don't need them, she said. You can tell who's who. He swallowed. You're right. He placed the drawing next to the others. The photograph. The first family drawing. The hallway. A strange collection. but it made sense to him. "Annie," he said after a moment, "do you ever get scared?" She thought about it. "Yes. What scares you?" he asked gently. She shrugged. "When my mom doesn't sleep well. When doctors talk outside the room. When people whisper." He nodded slowly. "Those are reasonable fears. What about you?" she asked. "Are you scared?" Daniel looked at the window, then back at her. "I'm scared of going home." Because it's empty?" "Yes. Could you make it not empty?" Annie asked. He smiled sadly. "It's not that simple. Nothing is," Annie said. "But you still try." He laughed quietly. "You sound like my conscience." "I don't know what that is," she said. "But it sounds important." "It is," he said. A knock came at the door. A doctor entered, followed by a nurse. They spoke in calm, measured tones, words floating past Annie without sticking. Progress, monitoring, discharge timeline. Annie watched Daniel's face as they talked, the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he nodded. When they left, the room felt smaller. "You're really leaving soon," Annie said. "Yes," Daniel said. "In a few days, most likely." She frowned. "Will you forget us?" "No," he said immediately. "I won't. Promise." "I promise," he said, and meant it. She studied him, as if deciding whether to believe him. Then she nodded once. "Okay." They sat quietly for a bit. Then Annie stood. "I need to go help my mom." Daniel nodded. "Tell her I hope she feels stronger tomorrow." "I will." As Annie turned to leave, Daniel said, "Annie?" "Yes." "Thank you," he said, "for coming every day." She shrugged, embarrassed. "You asked." She left, her footsteps light. Daniel lay back again, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, the thought of leaving the hospital didn't feel like being pushed back into emptiness. It felt like stepping into something uncertain. Yes, but not hollow. Down the hall, Annie helped her mother drink some water. "You look thoughtful," her mother said. "I think Daniel's scared," Annie replied. Her mother nodded. "People don't stop being scared just because they're adults." "I'm glad he's not alone," Annie said. Her mother looked at her daughter, at the quiet certainty in her voice, and felt something ache softly in her chest. Later that night, Daniel dreamed of a hallway filled with light. Daniel woke before dawn. The hospital still wrapped in that fragile quiet that only existed for a few hours each night. The lights in the hallway were dimmed, footsteps rare and careful. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow rhythm of his own breathing. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel hostile. He turned his head slightly and looked at the small table beside his bed. The photograph lay there, face up now. Next to it were Annie's drawings, 3 pieces of paper that had somehow shifted the gravity of the room. He reached out and touched the corner of the latest one, the hallway with the open door, and felt a faint, unexpected warmth spread through his chest. So this is what it feels like, he thought, to be seen without explanation. Later that afternoon, Annie arrived earlier than usual. Daniel knew because he heard her before he saw her. Not her voice, she rarely spoke loudly, but the familiar, quick rhythm of her steps. He looked toward the door just as she peeked inside. "You're early," he said. "My teacher had a meeting," Annie replied. "So we got out sooner." "That sounds like good luck," he said. She nodded seriously. "It is. I used the extra time to help my mom eat." "How is she today?" Daniel asked. Annie's smile dimmed, just slightly. "Tired. But she walked a little." "That's something," he said. She came in and sat down, quieter than usual. Daniel noticed immediately. "What's on your mind?" he asked. Annie hesitated, then said, "The nurse said you're leaving soon." "Yes," Daniel replied. "Probably in 2 days." Her legs stopped swinging. "Where will you go?" He exhaled slowly. "Home." "Alone?" "Yes." She looked down at her hands. "I don't like that word." "Neither do I," he admitted. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Annie looked up. "Will you still come see us?" Daniel blinked. "You mean after I leave?" "Yes," she said. "My mom will still be here for a while." He hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead. The question felt heavier than it should have, like a door he wasn't sure he was allowed to open. If your mother is comfortable with it, he said carefully. I would like that very much. Annie nodded, satisfied. She will be. You sound certain. She knows good people, Annie said, even when they don't know it yet. Daniel smiled. I'm starting to believe that. A nurse knocked and stepped in. Mr. Hale, we need to go over some discharge paperwork later today. Daniel nodded. All right. The nurse glanced at Annie, then back at him. Your friend can stay. Friend. The word settled into him differently now. Not awkward. Not undeserved. After the nurse left, Daniel said, They think I'm ready. Are you? Annie asked. He considered the question honestly. I think I'm less afraid than I was. That counts, Annie said. Yes, he agreed. It does. When Annie left to check on her mother, Daniel stayed where he was, thinking about empty houses, about quiet rooms, about how a life could feel full again without being loud. He found Annie's mother later that afternoon sitting by the window, her hands folded around a paper cup of water. Annie stood beside her, explaining something with careful seriousness. Daniel waited until Annie noticed him. Mom, Annie said, turning. This is Daniel. Her mother smiled, warm but reserved. We've met. Daniel nodded. I wanted to ask if it's all right. She tilted her head slightly. Ask what? I do one. If I could visit sometimes. After I'm discharged. He paused, then added, I know I'm a stranger. Her mother studied him. Not unkindly. Thoroughly. She saw the tiredness, the restraint, the quiet grief he carried without displaying. Strangers don't usually sit with children every day, she said, or listen to them the way you do. Daniel didn't interrupt. I think, she continued, that Annie has good instincts, and I trust her. Annie beamed. Then yes, her mother said. You'd be welcome. Daniel felt something in his chest loosen, just a fraction. Thank you. They stood together in the hallway for a moment. The three of them framed by passing lives. No one stared. No one hurried them along. That evening, Annie helped her mother back to bed and kissed her cheek goodnight. As she gathered her backpack, her mother said, You did something kind today. Annie frowned. I do kind things every day. Her mother smiled. Yes. But today, you changed something. Annie considered that. I think he changed too. Her mother nodded. Sometimes kindness works both ways. Down the hall, Daniel packed the few things he had brought with him. There wasn't much, but when he placed Annie's drawings carefully between his folded clothes, he did so with deliberate care. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't counting what he would be leaving behind. He was thinking about what he might be walking toward. Daniel was discharged on a Friday morning. The paperwork took longer than he expected. Forms slid across the desk, signatures collected, instructions delivered in careful, professional voices. He listened, nodded, asked the right questions. On the outside, he looked like a man who had done this sort of thing before. Organized, composed, ready. Inside, he felt unsteady. When everything was finished, he stood alone in the hallway for a moment, a small overnight bag at his feet. The hospital no longer felt like a cage, but leaving it still carried a strange weight. This place had held him together at his weakest. It had also given him something he hadn't known he was missing. He walked slowly toward Annie's mother's room. The door was open. Annie was sitting on the edge of the bed, her legs dangling, talking softly. Her mother lay back against the pillows, eyes half closed but alert. When Annie saw him, she hopped down at once. You're leaving, she said, stating it like a fact she had already accepted. Yes, Daniel replied. Today. Annie nodded, then did something unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged him around the waist, her arms brief but sure. Don't disappear, she said into his jacket. He felt the words land hard and gentle at the same time. I won't, he said. I promise. Her mother watched quietly, her expression unreadable. When Annie stepped back, she looked at Daniel. You look better, she said. I feel different, he replied. In a good way. She smiled faintly. That's progress too. They walked together down the hallway, slower than the nurses preferred but steady. At the entrance, Daniel stopped. The automatic doors waited, ready to open with a soft mechanical sigh. "I'll come by," he said. "Tomorrow, if that's okay." Annie grinned. "I'll be here." He hesitated, then looked at her mother. "I brought something," he said, reaching into his bag. He pulled out a folded envelope and handed it to her. She accepted it cautiously. "It's my number," he explained, "in case you ever need anything, or just want to talk." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." The doors opened. Cool air rushed in from outside. Daniel took one last look at the hallway, at the place where his life had quietly shifted direction, then stepped through. The city felt louder than he remembered. Traffic moved too fast. People brushed past him without noticing. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusting to the noise, the motion, the simple fact of being back in the world. His driver waited near the curb. "Home, sir?" the man asked. Daniel paused. The word felt strange. "Yes," he said finally. "Home." The house was exactly as he had left it. Too clean, too quiet. Every surface in its place, every room untouched. The staff had kept things running smoothly, efficiently, without leaving a trace of themselves behind. Daniel moved through the space slowly, setting his bag down, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a table, as if reacquainting himself with a former version of his life. He placed Annie's drawings on the kitchen counter. For a long time, he just stood there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sounds of the neighborhood. The emptiness pressed in, familiar and unwelcome. But it didn't crush him. The next afternoon, Daniel returned to the hospital. He wore jeans and a simple jacket, his hair still slightly damp from the shower. No one recognized him as anything other than another visitor. He liked that. Annie spotted him from the hallway and broke into a run. "You came," she said, breathless. "I said I would," he replied. Her mother followed more slowly, her steps careful. She smiled when she saw him. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said. They walked together, the three of them, just as they had before. Annie filled the silence with stories from school, from the neighbor's dog that barked too much, from the dream she'd had the night before. Daniel listened, answering when appropriate, laughing when it felt right. At the window, her mother grew tired. Daniel offered his arm without thinking. She accepted, surprised, then grateful. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked. "For coming back." He nodded. "I told you I would." As they stood there, Daniel realized something quietly monumental. He wasn't visiting out of obligation, or guilt, or charity. He was there because he wanted to be. That evening, after Annie went home, Daniel sat alone in his car for a moment before driving away. He looked up at the hospital windows, lit unevenly against the darkening sky. For the first time since the accident, the future didn't feel like a closed road. It felt uncertain, unmapped, and strangely, that felt like hope. Daniel began coming to the hospital every evening, not because he had promised, not because he felt obligated. He came because, somewhere between the automatic doors and the long walk down the familiar hallway, the tightness in his chest eased. The hospital was no longer just a place of sickness and loss. It had become a place where his days connected to someone else's. That evening, Annie was waiting near the nurse's station when he arrived, her backpack still on, her homework folder tucked under one arm. "You're early today," Daniel said. "So are you," Annie replied. "That means it's a good day." He smiled at that. "Is your mom awake?" "Yes. She's tired, but she wanted to walk." They found her mother sitting on the edge of the bed, carefully tying her robe. She looked up when she saw Daniel, a faint but genuine smile appearing on her face. "You didn't miss a day," she said. "I don't plan to," Daniel replied. They moved into the hallway together. Annie stayed close to her mother's side, her small hand steady and practiced. Daniel walked on the other side, matching their pace without comment. He had learned quickly that rushing was the fastest way to break trust. After a few minutes, Annie spoke. "Daniel?" "Yes. Why don't you ever talk about your work?" The question was innocent, but it landed heavier than most. Daniel considered his answer carefully. "Because my work used to be the most important thing in my life." "And now?" Annie asked. "And now," he said, "I'm not sure it should be." Her mother glanced at him, curiosity flickering across her face. "That's a hard thing to admit." "It is," Daniel said, "especially when everyone expects you to keep pretending it still matters more than anything else." Annie frowned. "Why would anyone want that?" Daniel smiled sadly. "Because when you're good at something, people like to keep you there. Even if it costs you." They reached the window and stopped. Outside, the city was alive in its usual way. People heading home. People going nowhere in particular. Lives unfolding without regard for the quiet moment happening behind the glass. "My mom says people don't get sick just in their bodies," Annie said suddenly. "They get sick in their lives too." Daniel felt the words settle slowly. "She's right." Her mother shifted slightly, her breathing uneven. Daniel noticed immediately. "Do you need to sit?" he asked. "Just for a minute," she replied. He guided her gently to a nearby bench, his hand firm but respectful. Annie watched closely, her eyes sharp with concern. "You're good at that," her mother said once she was seated. "At what?" "Not making people feel weak." Daniel looked down at his hands. "I know what it feels like to lose control. I don't want to take it away from anyone else." Annie sat on the floor at her mother's feet, leaning back against the bench. "I don't like when doctors talk over my mom," she said. "I don't either," Daniel replied. "People should be seen before they're treated." Her mother studied him for a long moment. "You sound like someone who's been invisible before." Daniel met her gaze. "I have." They sat together until her mother's strength faded. When they returned her to her room, Annie fluffed the pillow the way she always did, her movements careful and loving. "Thank you for walking with us," her mother said to Daniel. "You don't know how much it helps." "I think I do," he replied quietly. As Annie packed her bag, her mother watched Daniel from the corner of her eye. "You don't have to keep coming," she said gently. When Annie stepped into the bathroom, "I don't want you to feel responsible for us." Daniel shook his head. "I don't feel responsible. I feel connected." Her mother nodded slowly. "That's different." "Yes," he agreed. "It is," Annie returned, her jacket half-zipped. "I have homework," she announced. "But I finished the hard part." Daniel smiled. "What was the hard part?" "Math," she said flatly. "Words shouldn't have numbers." He laughed softly. "I can't argue with that." As they walked toward the exit, Annie looked up at him. "Do you ever miss being busy all the time?" Daniel thought about his calendar, once filled with meetings stacked back to back. Flights booked weeks in advance. Decisions made without pause. "Sometimes," he said, "but I don't miss feeling empty when everything stops." Annie nodded, satisfied. "That makes sense." At the doors, they stopped. Annie hugged him again, quick and sure. "See you tomorrow," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Tomorrow." Is the dial. As he drove away, Daniel realized something unsettling and hopeful at the same time. He was rearranging his life around these evenings, around a child's footsteps, around a quiet woman's steady presence. And for the first time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like choosing. By the second week, the hospital staff had stopped looking twice when Daniel appeared in the evening. He was no longer the man who drifted in and out with a visitor's badge clipped awkwardly to his jacket. He knew the rhythm now, the shift change, the quieter hours when the lights dimmed slightly, the moment when the hallways exhaled after a long day. Nurses nodded at him. One of the orderlies greeted him by name. Annie noticed before he did. "They know you," she said one afternoon as they walked together toward her mother's room. "I suppose they do," Daniel replied. "That means you belong here," Annie said, as if explaining a simple rule. Daniel smiled, but the word lingered with him. Belong. Her mother was resting when they arrived, eyes closed but not asleep. She opened them slowly and smiled when she saw Annie, then Daniel. "You're becoming part of the scenery," she said to him. "I hope that's a good thing," he replied. "It is," she said. "Hospitals need familiar faces." Annie set her backpack down and pulled out her homework. She spread her papers neatly across the small table, the way her mother had taught her, and began working without being asked. "You don't ever tell her to do her homework," Daniel observed quietly. Her mother smiled. "She does it because she knows it matters, not because she's afraid of being punished." Daniel nodded. "That's rare." "It shouldn't be," she said. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Annie worked through her assignments, occasionally frowning, occasionally muttering under her breath. Daniel watched, thinking about how different this felt from the evenings he used to spend alone, staring at screens, waiting for sleep to take him. "Daniel?" Annie said suddenly. "Yes? Why do people stop visiting hospitals when they don't have to?" she asked. "Like, when they're not sick anymore." He considered the question carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "that people are afraid of being reminded how fragile things are." Annie frowned. "But we're fragile all the time." Her mother chuckled softly. "She has a point." Daniel nodded. "She does. We just try very hard to forget." Later that evening, after Annie had helped her mother walk and settled her back into bed, Daniel lingered by the door. "Can I ask you something?" he said to her mother. She gestured for him to sit. "You don't know much about me," he said, "and I haven't exactly been honest by omission." Her eyes met his calmly. "You've never pretended to be something you're not." "No," he agreed. "But I haven't said who I am either." She studied him for a long moment. "Do you think that matters right now?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know." She smiled gently. "Then maybe it doesn't." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you." "For what?" "For letting me be here as I am." Her smile softened. "We all deserve that." 89. As Daniel walked Annie out later that night, she skipped slightly ahead of him, her energy returning now that her mother was settled. "You were quiet today," Annie said. "I was thinking," Daniel replied. "About what?" "About how quickly a life can change," he said. "And how slowly trust is built." Annie nodded seriously. "Trust is like homework," she said. "You do a little every day." Daniel laughed, the sound genuine. "That might be the best explanation I've ever heard." They stopped near the exit. Annie turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "Daniel," she said, "do you miss your family a lot?" The question was gentle, but it went straight to the center of him. "Yes," he said honestly. "Every day." "Does it hurt less now?" she asked. He thought of the drawings on his counter, of the quiet evenings, of the way the hospital no longer felt like a place of endings. "It hurts differently," he said. "Not smaller. Just softer around the edges." Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. "My mom says love doesn't go away when people do," she said. "It just waits." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "She's very wise." Annie smiled. "I know." That night, after Daniel returned home, he found himself standing in the doorway of his living room, looking at the space as if seeing it for the first time. It was still quiet, still orderly, but it no longer felt sealed off from the world. He took out his phone and stared at the contact he had saved earlier that week. A simple name, no title. He didn't call. Not yet, but for the first time, he didn't feel the familiar resistance rise up either. Back at the hospital, Annie lay in bed beside her mother, their nightly routine complete. Her mother brushed a hand through Annie's hair. "You're doing something important," she said softly. "I am?" Annie murmured, already half asleep. "Yes," her mother said. "You're reminding someone how to stay." Annie smiled faintly and drifted off, and in the quiet spaces between hospital walls and empty rooms, something slow and steady continued to grow. The change didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, in small adjustments Daniel barely noticed until they had already taken hold. He began leaving work earlier, not dramatically, not with announcements or explanations. Meetings ended when they ended. Calls were returned the next morning instead of late at night. His assistant noticed first but didn't comment. People who had worked around Daniel long enough had learned that when he made a decision, it wasn't up for debate. That afternoon, he arrived at the hospital with a paper bag in his hand. Annie spotted it immediately. "What's that?" she asked, peering into the bag as they walked toward her mother's room. "Soup," Daniel said. "From a place down the street. They make it fresh." Annie considered this. "Is it better than hospital soup?" "I hope so," he replied, "but that depends on who you ask." Was not the Vetters. Her mother was sitting up when they entered, her hair pulled back, her posture careful but more upright than usual. When she saw the bag, her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Daniel replied. "I wanted to." She accepted the soup anyway. her expression softening when she tasted it. "This is good," she admitted. "Very good." Annie grinned, satisfied. "I told you he listens." Daniel laughed. "I'm learning." They ate together, unhurried. Annie told a long story about a classmate who had gotten in trouble for talking too much, complete with dramatic pauses and exaggerated expressions. Her mother listened, amused, occasionally adding a comment. Daniel found himself watching the exchange more than the story itself, struck by the ease between them, by how natural it felt to be included. Afterward, Annie helped her mother walk, the three of them moving at a steady pace down the hallway. They didn't talk much this time. There was no need to fill the space. At the window, Annie pressed her hands to the glass. "It looks colder today." "It is," Daniel said. "Winter's coming." "I like winter," Annie replied. "It makes people stay." Her mother glanced at Daniel, then back at Annie. "Some people," she said gently, "don't like staying." Annie shrugged. "Then they should learn." Daniel smiled, but something in her words stayed with him. Later, as Annie stepped away to speak with a nurse, Daniel turned to her mother. "May I ask you something?" he said. She nodded. "Of course. Why do you let her carry so much?" he asked. The question came out carefully, without judgment, but it was honest. Her mother didn't bristle. She thought about it. "I don't let her," she said quietly. "She chooses to. And when someone chooses to love, you don't stop them unless it's hurting them." "Is it?" Daniel asked. She met his gaze steadily. "No. What would hurt her is pretending this doesn't matter." Daniel nodded slowly. "That makes sense." She studied him for a moment. "You're not asking out of curiosity." "No," he admitted. "I'm asking because I'm afraid of taking too much." She smiled, not unkindly. "You're not taking. You're showing up. There's a difference." That evening, as Daniel drove home, he found himself replaying her words. Showing up. It sounded simple. It wasn't. 2 days later, Daniel arrived to find Annie sitting alone in the hallway, her backpack at her feet. "Where's your mom?" he asked, a knot forming in his chest before he could stop it. "She's resting," Annie said. "The doctor said she needs more sleep today." Daniel sat beside her. "Are you okay?" Annie nodded, but it wasn't convincing. "I don't like when they close the door." "I know," he said. "Neither do I." They sat together, quiet. After a while, Annie leaned against his arm without asking. He stayed very still, aware of the weight of the moment, of the trust it represented. "Daniel," she said. "Yes. If my mom gets better," she began, then stopped. "When?" he corrected gently. She looked up at him. "When my mom gets better, will you still come?" The question wasn't small. It carried something deeper than the words themselves. Daniel didn't answer right away. He wanted to say the right thing, not the easy thing. "Yes," he said finally. "I will, even if we don't need help anymore?" "Yes," he repeated. "Even then." Annie considered this, then nodded. "Okay." That night, Daniel stood in his kitchen, staring at the drawings now taped carefully to the refrigerator. The photograph remained on the counter, but it no longer felt like an anchor pulling him backward. It felt like a reminder of where he had been, not where he was trapped. He took out his phone and opened his calendar. One by one, he moved things around. Canceled a dinner he didn't want to attend. Rescheduled a meeting that could wait. Left entire evenings deliberately blank. For the first time in years, the empty spaces didn't scare him. They felt intentional. Back at the hospital the next afternoon, Annie's mother was awake again. She looked tired but present. When Daniel arrived, she greeted him with a small nod, something more familiar than polite. "You didn't have to come today," she said. "I know," he replied. "I wanted to." She smiled. "You keep saying that, and I'll keep meaning it." As Annie helped her mother sit up, Daniel watched them, the quiet efficiency of their movements, the wordless understanding between them. He felt something settle into place, not as a rush or a spark, but as a steady alignment. This was not charity, not obligation. It was choice. And choice, he was beginning to understand, was where everything real began. Daniel didn't tell anyone when he began rearranging his life around hospital hours. There was no announcement, no dramatic declaration. He simply started saying no to things that no longer fit. Dinners that ran late, meetings scheduled for evenings, weekends that once belonged to obligations instead of people. His assistant noticed the changes, raised an eyebrow once, then quietly adjusted. She had worked with him long enough to know when questions weren't welcome. That afternoon, he arrived at the hospital later than usual. Annie was already there, sitting beside her mother's bed, reading aloud from a thin paperback. Her voice rose and fell with the story, careful and patient. When she noticed Daniel in the doorway, her face lit up, but she didn't stop reading until she reached the end of the page. "You're late," she said, closing the book. "I know," Daniel replied. "I'm sorry." Her mother smiled faintly. "You don't need to apologize. You have a life." Daniel paused. "So do you." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I suppose I do." Annie hopped off the chair. "The doctor came earlier," she said. "They changed Mom's medicine." Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "Is that good?" her mother answered before Annie could. "It means they're trying something different." He nodded, understanding more than the words alone conveyed. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said honestly, "but not hopeless." "I wasn't." Annie looked between them. "Hope is important," she said firmly. "Yes," Daniel agreed. "It is." They walked that evening, slower than usual. Her mother needed more breaks, more pauses. Daniel stayed close, his presence steady but unobtrusive. He had learned when to offer an arm and when to simply wait. At one point, they sat on the bench near the window. The sky outside was dark already, the city lights blinking on like distant signals. "I used to sit in offices like that," Daniel said, nodding toward the skyline. "High up, glass walls, everything quiet and controlled. And now?" her mother asked. "And now I sit here," he said. "And it feels more real." She smiled gently. "Real isn't always comfortable." "No," he said. "But it's honest." Annie swung her legs, listening. "My mom says honesty is when you don't pretend you're not scared." Daniel looked at her. "Your mom says a lot of things that stick. We have code C for." "She's very wise," Annie replied, completely serious. That night, after Annie had gone home, Daniel stayed behind for a few minutes. He stood in the hallway outside her mother's room, hands in his pockets, uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" he said when she noticed him. "Of course," she replied. "Have you thought about what comes after?" he asked carefully. "After the hospital. I mean," she didn't pretend not to understand. "I think about it all the time. It is not, and I don't have answers," she said. "Just Annie. And whatever strength I can gather each day." Daniel nodded. "If you ever need help, practical help, I want you to know you can ask." She looked at him steadily. "That's generous. But I don't want you to feel responsible." "I don't," he said quietly. "I want to feel useful." She smiled, a little sad, a little grateful. "Those aren't the same thing." He absorbed that, nodding slowly. The next afternoon, Daniel arrived to find Annie upset. She sat in the hallway, knees pulled to her chest, her backpack untouched beside her. When she saw him, she didn't jump up the way she usually did. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside her. She hesitated, then said, "They wouldn't let me stay in the room this morning." His jaw tightened. "Why?" "They said Mom needed tests," Annie replied, "and I had to wait." "That's hard," he said gently. She nodded. "I don't like not knowing." Neither did he. They waited together, saying very little. When the nurse finally came out and waved them in, Annie bolted to her mother's side. Daniel followed more slowly. Her mother looked exhausted, but she smiled when she saw Annie. "I'm okay," she said before Annie could ask. Annie nodded, relief flooding her face. She turned to Daniel. "See? She's okay." "Yes," he said. "I see." Later, as Annie helped her mother rest, Daniel stood by the window, his thoughts heavy. He had spent years believing control was the answer to uncertainty. Now he was learning how little control mattered when it came to the people you cared about. That evening, as he walked Annie out, she said, "Daniel?" "Yes?" "If something happens to my mom," she began, then stopped. She swallowed. Will you still remember us? The question landed like a quiet blow. I will, he said without hesitation. No matter what. She studied his face, searching for something. Then she nodded. Okay. He watched her disappear into the night, her small figure swallowed by the city. For a long time, he stood there, the weight of her trust pressing gently but firmly against his chest. Back at home, Daniel sat at his desk, the lights low. He opened a folder he hadn't touched in months. Documents, financial summaries, numbers that once defined his sense of worth. He stared at them, then closed the folder. For the first time, he considered a future shaped not by loss or legacy, but by presence. And that idea, quiet, unassuming, felt more radical than anything he had ever built. The hospital called Daniel the next morning. The number was unfamiliar, but something in his chest tightened before he answered. Mr. Hale? A woman asked. Her voice was calm, professional. This is Mercy Hospital. I'm calling regarding Miss Johnson. Daniel sat up straighter. Is she? She's stable, the nurse said quickly. But there have been some changes. We thought it would be appropriate to update you. He listened carefully as she explained. Adjustments to medication, a longer stay than initially expected, the kind of language that sounded neutral but carried weight beneath it. Her daughter is with her, the nurse added. She asked for you. Daniel didn't hesitate. I'm on my way. When he arrived, the hallway outside her room was quieter than usual. The lights seemed dimmer, the air heavier. Annie sat in a chair near the door, her backpack on the floor, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up when she saw him, relief flickering across her face before she tried to hide it. You came fast, she said. I told you I would, Daniel replied, lowering himself into the chair beside her. She nodded, then stared straight ahead. They're doing more tests. I know, he said gently. They keep saying words I don't like, Annie continued. Like monitoring and response, Daniel understood. Sometimes adults use big words because they're scared too. She looked at him then. Are you scared? Yes, he said honestly. But I'm here. That seemed to matter. Annie leaned against his arm, her head resting there like it belonged. Daniel stayed still, aware of the trust in that small gesture, the quiet permission it represented. After a while, the door opened. Annie's mother looked tired but awake, her eyes softening when she saw them together. You didn't have to sit out here, she said to Annie. Annie stood immediately. I wanted to. Daniel followed them inside. The room felt smaller than before, crowded with equipment and unspoken worry. He stayed near the window, present but careful not to intrude. How are you feeling? He asked. She considered the question. Like my body and I are negotiating. He smiled faintly. That sounds familiar. She glanced at him, surprised. You? I spent a long time fighting what I didn't want to accept, he said. It took more energy than I realized, replied it. Annie climbed onto the chair beside the bed and took her mother's hand. You don't have to fight alone, she said. Her mother squeezed her fingers. I know. They sat together quietly. No one rushed the silence. When a doctor came in, Daniel stepped back, letting them speak. He watched Annie's face as the words flowed around her, saw the way she latched onto tone rather than meaning, searching for reassurance between syllables. When the doctor left, Annie asked the question none of them wanted to say out loud. Are you going to get better? Her mother met her eyes. I'm going to try, she said. Every day. Annie nodded, accepting the promise for what it was. Later, while Annie helped her mother rest, Daniel stepped into the hallway. He leaned against the wall, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the fear wash through him instead of pushing it away. He had learned, slowly, that fear didn't disappear when ignored. It only grew sharper. A nurse approached quietly. She's lucky, she said, nodding toward the room. Most patients don't have this kind of support. Daniel looked back at the door. We're lucky too. That evening, Annie walked with him to the exit. She was quieter than usual, her steps slower. Daniel? She said. Yes? If my mom has to stay a long time, she asked carefully, can you still come? He stopped walking and knelt slightly so they were at eye level. Annie, he said, I'm not going anywhere. She searched his face, then nodded. Okay. Outside, the air was cold, the sky already dark. Daniel watched Annie disappear down the sidewalk, then stood there longer than necessary, the weight of the day settling into him. That night, he didn't go straight home. He drove instead, through streets he hadn't taken in years, past neighborhoods he had once avoided because they reminded him of what he had lost. He parked in front of his house eventually, sitting in the car with the engine off, thinking, for years, his wealth had insulated him. From pain, from need, from the kind of uncertainty that demanded presence instead of solutions. Now, standing on the edge of someone else's fragile world, he understood something he hadn't before. You couldn't protect people from loss by staying distant. You could only protect them from being alone. The next day, Daniel arrived at the hospital with a small bag. Inside were fresh clothes, toiletries, a book Annie's mother had mentioned once in passing. He placed it quietly in the room, not making a show of it. Her mother noticed anyway. You're very thoughtful, she said. I'm paying attention, he replied. She smiled, tired but sincere. That matters more. Oh. Annie watched them from her chair, something thoughtful in her eyes. You're staying, she said, not as a question. Yes, Daniel replied. She leaned back, satisfied. Good. That evening, as Annie slept curled beside her mother, Daniel sat alone by the window, city lights blinking on one by one. He thought about the photographs still on his counter at home, about the drawings taped to his refrigerator, about the quiet way his life was being reassembled around something smaller, truer. For the first time in a long while, he didn't wonder how this story would end. He wondered how it would continue. The truth came out on a Tuesday evening, quietly and without ceremony. Annie was in her mother's room, coloring at the small table by the window, her feet tucked beneath the chair. Daniel stood near the door, listening as Annie's mother spoke with a social worker. The conversation was calm, practical, the kind that used gentle words to discuss difficult realities. We'll need to review your coverage, the woman said. Some of the extended care won't be fully covered. There are options, but they involve applications, waiting lists. Annie looked up. Waiting for what? The social worker smiled kindly. For help. Sweetheart. Daniel felt something settle uncomfortably in his chest. After the woman left, the room felt quieter than before. Annie went back to coloring, her pencil moving slower now. Her mother leaned back against the pillows, eyes closed for a moment. I didn't want her to hear all that, she said softly. Daniel nodded. She hears more than we think. Annie didn't look up. I know we don't have a lot of money, she said. That's okay. Her mother reached for her hand. It shouldn't have to be just okay. That night, after Annie had gone home, Daniel stayed behind. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the reflection of the room in the glass. There's something I should tell you, he said finally. Her mother looked at him, attentive but calm. All right, Tuvra. I haven't been completely honest, he said. Not because I wanted to deceive you, because I didn't want it to matter. She studied his face. What didn't you want to matter? My name, he said. What I do. What I have. She waited. I run a company, he continued. Several, actually. I've been fortunate. The word felt inadequate even as he said it. She absorbed this without reaction. How fortunate. Daniel met her eyes. More than most. The silence stretched. He braced himself for the shift he had seen so many times before. The recalculation. The distance. Instead, she said, does that change who you are when you sit in this chair? No, he replied immediately. Then I don't need details, she said. I needed honesty. He let out a breath. I didn't want Annie to see me differently. Her mother glanced toward the door. She sees what's in front of her. The next day, the truth found Annie anyway. They were walking in the hallway when a man in a tailored suit approached Daniel, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Mr. Hale, we need your signature on the revised proposal, the board. Daniel held up a hand. Not here. The man glanced at Annie, startled, then nodded quickly and walked away. Annie stopped. Why did he call you that? Daniel knelt slightly so they were eye to eye. That's my last name, He talked like you were important, she said. Daniel smiled faintly. Some people think I am. Annie considered this. Are you rich? Daniel didn't lie. Yes. She frowned. Like, really rich? Yes. She thought for a moment longer, then asked the question that mattered. Are you still you? He felt something tighten behind his eyes. Yes, he said. I am. She nodded. Okay, that was it. No awe, no fear, no sudden distance. Later, as they sat by her mother's bed, Annie colored another picture. When she finished, she held it up. It showed 3 people again. But this time, the door at the end of the hallway was closed. Above it, Annie had drawn a small sign. What does it say? Daniel asked. She turned the paper toward him. The letters were uneven but careful. No one left behind. Her mother smiled. That's a strong message. It's true, Annie said. People get left behind when no one looks back. Daniel felt the weight of it settle into him. For years, he had moved forward without looking back, telling himself it was necessary, efficient, clean. Now he saw the cost. That evening, Daniel made a call he had been postponing. He sat in his car outside the hospital, engine off, phone pressed to his ear. The voice on the other end was familiar, deferential. I need a review of our community care programs, Daniel said. Specifically, hospital support, quiet funding, no press. There was a pause. Any particular reason, sir? Yes, Daniel replied. There are people who don't ask. They still deserve help. He ended the call and sat back, heart pounding not with fear, but with clarity. Inside, Annie's mother slept. Annie sat beside her, reading softly. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching, understanding now that the line between presence and responsibility had shifted. He wasn't there to save them. He was there to stay. And staying, he was learning, was a choice that carried consequences. Not the kind that could be managed on paper, but the kind that asked for courage. When Annie looked up and saw him, she smiled. You're thinking again, she said. Yes, he replied. But it's a good kind. She nodded. Thinking is okay. As long as you don't leave. I won't, he said. And for the first time, he knew exactly what that promise meant. The first time Daniel brought Annie's mother home from the hospital, it was raining. Not hard, just enough to blur the edges of the city and soften the noise. Daniel held an umbrella over her head as she stepped carefully onto the sidewalk. Annie hovering close, her hand ready at her mother's elbow. You don't have to fuss, her mother said, though her voice was tired. I know, Daniel replied. I'm choosing to. Annie nodded approvingly, as if this settled something important. The drive was quiet. Annie watched the rain trail down the windows, tracing invisible paths. Her mother sat back, eyes closed, breathing slow and measured. Daniel drove carefully, aware of every turn, every stoplight, as if smoothness itself were a form of respect. When they arrived, Annie stared. The house wasn't loud or grand the way she had imagined rich houses might be. It was calm, clean, too calm, maybe. The kind of quiet that held its breath. This is where you live? Annie asked. Yes, Daniel said, opening the door. Her mother took it in more slowly. High ceilings, light that didn't have to fight to get in, space that hadn't learned how to be shared yet. It's peaceful, she said. It wasn't, Daniel replied. Not until recently. Inside, Daniel showed them the guest room he had prepared. Fresh sheets, a chair by the window, a small lamp Annie could reach on her own. I thought you might like the light, he said to her mother. For reading, or resting, we were life to have a govet. She touched the edge of the bed, then looked at him. You've done a lot. I wanted to do it right, he said. That night, Annie fell asleep quickly, curled at the edge of the bed beside her mother, the way she always did when things felt uncertain. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, then quietly closed the door. Downstairs, the house felt different already. The next morning, Annie woke early and explored. She patted down the stairs in her socks, counting each step under her breath. She wandered into the kitchen, opening cabinets she was told were okay to open, finding mugs, plates, a drawer full of mismatched spoons. When Daniel came in, she was sitting at the table, Drawing. You're up early, he said. My mom's still sleeping, Annie replied. That means it's a good morning. Daniel smiled. He started making breakfast, nothing fancy. Eggs, toast, fruit. Annie watched him carefully. You cook? She asked, surprised. I can, he said. I don't always. You should, she said. It makes places feel real. He nodded. I'm learning that. Later, when her mother joined them, wrapped in a sweater Daniel had laid out the night before, she paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. This feels strange, she said softly. Good, strange, or bad strange? Annie asked. Her mother smiled. Good, strange. They spent the morning slowly. No schedule, no alarms. Annie did homework at the kitchen table. Her mother rested on the couch. Daniel answered a few emails, then closed his laptop and left it closed. At one point, Annie looked up. You're not working. I am, Daniel replied. Just not on the things I used to. Her mother watched him then, really watched him, seeing not the wealth or the house, but the way he adjusted his pace to theirs, the way he listened more than he spoke. That afternoon, a delivery arrived. Groceries, fresh bread, soup. Annie helped unpack, naming each item like a small ceremony. This one's mine, she said, holding up a box of cereal. Daniel laughed. Fair enough. In the quiet moments, when Annie was busy and her mother rested, Daniel felt the weight of the choice he had made, not doubt something deeper. Responsibility, presence, the understanding that staying meant adjusting, again and again. That evening, as Annie colored on the floor and the house settled around them, her mother spoke. I need to ask you something, she said. Of course, Daniel replied. Why us? She asked. Not accusatory, honest. Daniel thought carefully. Because you didn't ask, he said. And because Annie didn't see me as anything but a man who needed company. I forgot what that felt like. She nodded slowly. And when this gets harder, it will, he agreed. But I won't pretend it won't. She looked at him, something steady passing between them. Then we're choosing this together. Yes, he said. Together. Annie looked up from her drawing. What are we choosing? Her mother smiled. To stay. Annie nodded, satisfied, and went back to coloring. That night, after Annie was asleep and the house quieted into something warmer than before, Daniel stood in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator. The drawings were still there, joined now by a new one Annie had taped up herself. 3 figures, a house, a door open. Daniel rested his hand against the cool surface and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what staying would cost him. He was afraid of what leaving would take away. Living together changed things in ways none of them had fully anticipated. It wasn't dramatic. There were no arguments, no grand moments of realization. The changes came quietly, through habits forming where emptiness had once lived, through mornings that began with footsteps instead of silence, through evenings shaped by simple routines rather than careful avoidance. Annie adapted first. By the 3rd day, she had claimed a corner of the living room for her drawings. Papers spread across the floor, crayons lined up with surprising precision. She learned which cabinet held the snacks Daniel didn't mind her taking, and which one was for later. She learned the sound of his footsteps and could tell, without looking, whether he was tired or simply thinking. Daniel watched this happen with a mixture of amazement and humility. He had spent years believing that control was the foundation of stability. Yet here was a child rearranging his house without asking permission. And instead of disruption, there was balance. Her mother took longer. She moved carefully, always aware of her body, always measuring her strength. Some days she sat at the kitchen table and talked with Daniel over tea, her voice steady, her humor dry and understated. Other days she stayed on the couch, eyes closed, energy conserved like a precious resource. Daniel never pushed. He learned quickly that offering help didn't mean insisting, that dignity mattered more than efficiency. When she needed assistance, she asked. When she didn't, he stepped back. One evening, as Annie worked on a puzzle at the coffee table, her mother looked at Daniel across the room. You're very quiet, she said. I'm listening, he replied. She smiled faintly. You do that a lot. I didn't used to, he admitted. I was always waiting to speak. She nodded. Listening changes how people feel around you. He glanced at Annie, who was humming softly to herself. It changes how places feel too. That night, after Annie was asleep, Daniel sat alone in his study. The room was exactly as it had always been, dark wood, clean lines, framed certificates that marked achievements he had once thought defined him. He looked at them now and felt distance, not resentment, just clarity. He reached for his phone and scrolled through emails. Unread messages stacking up with familiar urgency. Invitations, proposals, requests that assumed his availability was endless. He closed the inbox. Instead, he opened a blank document and began to write. Not plans, not strategies, just notes. Thoughts about time, about presence, about the difference between being needed and being chosen. He stopped when he heard soft footsteps. Annie stood in the doorway, rubbing one eye, her hair rumpled. I had a bad dream. Daniel stood immediately. Do you want me to get your mom? She shook her head. Can I just sit for a minute? Of course, he said. She climbed into the chair beside him, curling her legs under herself. For a moment, neither spoke. What was it about? He asked gently. I couldn't find her, Annie said. Everyone kept telling me to wait. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest. That sounds scary. She nodded. I don't like waiting. I don't either, he said. Sometimes waiting feels like being forgotten. She looked at him, surprised. Yes, that. He rested his hand lightly on the arm of the chair, close but not touching. You're not forgotten, he said. Not here. Annie leaned back, satisfied, and within minutes her breathing evened out again. Daniel watched her until he was sure she was asleep, then carried her carefully back to bed. In the morning, her mother thanked him quietly. She doesn't usually wander at night, she said, but new places bring old fears. I understand, Daniel replied. New places do that to adults too. She smiled at him, a look that held both gratitude and something deeper. Trust, perhaps, or recognition. That afternoon, they sat together in the kitchen while Annie did her homework. Daniel, her mother said suddenly, you don't have to keep rearranging your life around us. He didn't answer right away. He watched Annie erase a mistake and start again, patient with herself. I know, he said finally, but I want to. She studied him. Wanting can be dangerous. Yes, he agreed. But it can also be honest. She nodded slowly. I'm afraid of leaning too much. I'm afraid of pulling away, he said. They shared a quiet understanding then, not spoken aloud but fully present. Later that week, Daniel took Annie to school for the first time. She walked beside him, her hand slipping into his without hesitation. Other parents glanced at them, some curious, some distracted, but Annie didn't notice. At the gate, she turned to him. You're doing pickup today too, right? Yes, he said. She smiled. Good. As she disappeared into the crowd of children, Daniel stood there for a moment longer than necessary. He felt the weight of the ordinary miracle he had stepped into. This wasn't rescue. This wasn't charity. It was life, unfolding slowly, asking him to stay awake. That evening, Annie's mother rested while Daniel cooked dinner. Annie perched on a stool, offering commentary. You cut carrots weird, she said. I do, he admitted. But it still works, she concluded. Yes, he said. It does. They ate together at the table, the room filled with the quiet sounds of a shared meal. Annie talked about her day. Her mother listened, tired but present. Daniel watched them both, aware that something irrevocable had already happened. He was no longer visiting a life that wasn't his. He was living it. The idea of the proposal didn't arrive as a sudden revelation. It grew slowly, quietly, the way everything real in Daniel's life seemed to now. It began with Annie. She was sitting at the kitchen table one Saturday morning, cereal forgotten, drawing with intense concentration. Daniel stood at the counter making coffee, watching her out of the corner of his eye. What are you making? He asked. A plan, Annie replied without looking up. A plan for what? For later, she said, as if that explained everything. He smiled. Later today, or later in life? She finally looked up at him, serious. Later life. Daniel laughed softly. That sounds important. It is, she said, then went back to drawing. He didn't think much of it until that evening, when Annie's mother joined them at the table, moving a little slower than usual but smiling more easily these days. Annie slid the paper toward her. Her mother studied it, then looked up, surprised. It's us, she said. The drawing showed 3 figures again, but this time they stood in front of a house. The door was open. Above them, Annie had written carefully, her letters uneven but determined. Still here. Her mother swallowed. That's beautiful, Annie. Daniel felt something stir deep in his chest, quiet and insistent. Later that night, after Annie was asleep, Daniel and her mother sat in the living room. The lights were low. The house settled into a comfortable hush. Rain tapped gently against the windows. You've made a home here, she said softly. We have, he replied, then corrected himself. You have. She looked at him, understanding the weight behind the words. You don't have to give us permanence to make this real. I know, he said. But I want to. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was careful. I need to know something before this goes any further. With good no. Anything, he said. Are you choosing us because you're afraid to be alone again? She asked. Or because you truly want this life? Daniel didn't rush to answer. He thought of the empty house before Annie's footsteps filled it. Of the nights when silence felt like punishment. Of the mornings now shaped by routine and purpose. I'm choosing this because I've learned that love doesn't come from avoiding pain, he said slowly. It comes from accepting the risk of it. Was not this time. She studied his face, searching for hesitation. She found none. And Annie? She asked. She's been through enough loss. Daniel nodded. I would never promise her something I couldn't keep. Her eyes softened. That matters. The next few weeks passed gently. There were doctor visits. Days when her strength surprised them. Days when it didn't. Daniel adjusted his work further, carving out time with deliberate care. He attended school meetings, learned the names of Annie's teachers, sat through one painfully long recital where Annie played 3 wrong notes and beamed anyway. You did great, he told her afterward. I know, she said. I practiced. Her mother watched them together, something warm and cautious growing in her chest. One afternoon, Daniel took Annie to the park while her mother rested. They sat on a bench, watching children run and shout and fall and get back up again. Daniel, Annie said. Yes? Do you love my mom? The question was direct, unfiltered. Daniel didn't pretend to misunderstand. Yes, he said. She nodded, accepting this as fact. Do you love me? Yes, he said again, just as simply. Annie considered this, swinging her legs. Then you should tell her. I will, he said. That evening, he did. There was no grand setup, no restaurant, no speech rehearsed in advance. Just the 3 of them in the living room, Annie on the floor with her drawings, her mother resting on the couch. Daniel sat across from her, his posture steady but his heart loud. I love you, he said. And I love Annie. I don't want to build a life around fear anymore. I want to build it with you. She looked at him for a long moment, emotion flickering across her face. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I, he said. But I'm here. Annie looked up. Is this the part where you stay forever? Daniel smiled. If you'll have me. Annie grinned and went back to drawing, satisfied. A few days later, Daniel took Annie's mother back to the hospital, not as a patient this time, but as a visitor. They walked the familiar hallway together, slower now, more reflective. When they reached the spot by the window where so many quiet conversations had begun, Daniel stopped. This is where everything changed, he said. She nodded. For all of us. Daniel reached into his pocket. I didn't want a stage, he said. I wanted truth. He knelt, right there in the hallway where nurses passed and monitors beeped and life went on without ceremony. Will you marry me? He asked. Not because I can offer certainty, but because I can offer presence. Every day. Tears slipped down her face. She didn't wipe them away. Yes, she said. Yes, I will. Annie gasped. "I knew it," she announced, jumping up. "I made a plan, Dean, and..." They laughed then, the sound echoing softly down the corridor. Later that night, as Annie slept between them on the couch, Daniel watched the two people who had reshaped his world without asking permission. He had built empires before, but this was the bravest thing he had ever chosen. They didn't rush the wedding. There was no urgency in proving anything to anyone. No need to turn their choice into a spectacle. Life had taught all three of them that permanence wasn't created by ceremonies alone, but by the quiet decision to wake up and stay. Still, once the question had been asked and answered, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change the way the days leaned toward each other. Annie began calling it the after. "Well, Bear, is this before or after?" she asked one morning at breakfast. Daniel looked up from his coffee. "After what?" "After you asked," she said, as if it were obvious. Her mother smiled. "I think this is after." "Good," Annie said. "I like after." Her health continued in uneven waves. There were good mornings when she sat at the table and helped Annie with homework, her voice steady, her eyes clear. And there were afternoons when the couch became her whole world, when even speaking felt like lifting weight she hadn't agreed to carry. Daniel learned the rhythm without being taught. He learned how to read her silences, how to offer help without making it feel like rescue, how to sit beside her on the difficult days and talk about ordinary things, weather, food. A show Annie insisted on watching so the illness didn't take up more space than it already demanded. One evening, after Annie had gone to bed, she reached for his hand. "I need to say something out loud," she said. "Take your time," Daniel replied. "I don't know how long I'll have," she said. Not fearful, not dramatic, just honest. "And I won't pretend that doesn't scare me." He squeezed her hand gently. "It scares me too. I don't want you to build your future around waiting for me to disappear," she continued. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not waiting. I'm living. I move." She studied his face, searching for doubt, for hesitation, finding none. "You're a stubborn man," she said softly. He smiled. "I've been told. And Annie," she added, her voice tightening just slightly, "she's attached to you." "I know," he said. "Are you ready for that kind of permanence?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He thought of school mornings, of homework at the kitchen table, of nightmares and bad dreams and quiet reassurances, of the way Annie reached for his hand without thinking. "Yes," he said. "I am." She closed her eyes, relief washing over her face. "Then whatever happens, I know she won't be alone." Neither of them said more. The wedding itself was small. Annie insisted on that. "Big weddings make people nervous," she declared. "And we already did the important part." Daniel laughed. "Which part is that?" "Staying," Annie said. They chose a simple ceremony in the hospital chapel. It wasn't symbolic in the way people usually meant, but it was true. This was where their lives had collided, where fear had softened into connection, where three separate paths had quietly braided themselves together. A nurse Annie liked braided her hair that morning, careful and gentle. Daniel wore a suit he hadn't touched in years, though he skipped the tie. Her mother wore a simple dress, her hands steady, her posture proud. When she walked down the aisle slow, measured, but unassisted, Daniel felt his breath catch. "You came back," he whispered when she reached him. "You gave me a reason to," she whispered back. Annie stood between them, holding both their hands, her shoes slightly scuffed, her expression solemn with importance. The vows were simple. "I promise to stay," Daniel said. "Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I promise to choose this life," she said. "Not because it's easy, but because it's honest." Annie cleared her throat. "And I promise," she added loudly, "to tell you when you're doing it wrong." They laughed then, the sound echoing softly against the chapel walls. For a moment, it felt like the world paused. Afterward, there was cake in the hospital cafeteria. A small one. Chocolate. Because Annie refused anything else. Nurses passed by and smiled. Someone took pictures on a phone that would later feel far more precious than any professional photograph. That night, back at the house, Annie fell asleep curled against her mother, exhaustion finally winning. Daniel watched them from the doorway, his chest full in a way that still surprised him. Later, when the house was quiet, she found him in the kitchen. "Do you ever think about the life you would have had if we hadn't walked into that room?" she asked. "Yes," he admitted. "Sometimes. Dewey. And I don't miss it," he said. She nodded. "Neither do I." The months that followed weren't a miracle. There were hospital visits, adjustments to medication, days when the fear crept in quietly, trying to convince them that loving like this was reckless. But there were also ordinary triumphs. Annie learning to ride a bike, burned dinners that became jokes instead of failures, evenings spent on the couch, feet tangled, watching movies none of them fully paid attention to. Her health stabilized, not cured, not transformed, but steadier than anyone had predicted. The doctors used careful words. Daniel didn't push them to promise anything. Time, he had learned, wasn't something you conquered. It was something you honored. One night, as Annie slept upstairs and the house settled into its familiar hush, she took Daniel's hand. "Whatever happens," she said, "promise me one thing." "Anything," he replied. "Promise me you won't let fear decide what this meant," she said. "No matter how it ends." Daniel met her eyes. "I promise." She smiled, content. "Then we're already okay." And in that quiet kitchen, with the house holding their shared breath, Daniel understood something fully at last. Love wasn't the absence of loss. It was the courage to live anyway. 2 years later, the mornings were still quiet but no longer empty. Daniel woke to the sound of movement upstairs. Not hurried, not heavy, just the familiar rhythm of a house that had learned how to breathe with more than one heart inside it. He lay still for a moment, listening. A drawer opening. Bare feet on the floor. Annie humming off key. The same tune she always hummed when she thought no one was listening. He smiled. When he reached the kitchen, Annie was already there, standing on a chair, carefully pouring cereal. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "You're late," she said. "I was listening," he replied. She nodded, approving. "Mom's in the garden." Daniel stepped outside. She sat wrapped in a light blanket, the morning sun resting gently on her face. The garden wasn't large, but it was alive. Flowers Annie had insisted on planting, herbs Daniel had never learned the names of. A small bench that had become their quiet meeting place. "You're up early," he said. "I wanted to feel the day start," she replied. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. For a moment, neither spoke. Her health had settled into a fragile but persistent rhythm. There were still bad days, still doctor visits, still the careful balance between hope and realism. But she was here, present, laughing more easily now, speaking of the future in weeks and months without flinching. "You know," she said softly, "they never expected this." "I know," Daniel replied. "The doctors," she continued, "they still call it unusual, unprecedented." Daniel smiled. "I call it stubborn." She laughed quietly. "So do I." Inside, Annie called out, "I can't find my blue bowl." "Ew, it's in the dishwasher," Daniel answered without turning. "How do you know?" she demanded. "Because yesterday you said it was your favorite and put it there yourself." There was a pause. Then, "Oh, right." She appeared in the doorway a moment later, bowl in hand. "You're very good at remembering things." Daniel looked at her. "So are you." She considered this, then smiled and went back inside. Later that afternoon, they returned to the hospital, not as patients, as visitors. Annie walked ahead, confident now, her steps no longer hesitant in the maze of hallways. She waved at a nurse who recognized her immediately. "Look at you," the woman said. "All grown up." Annie grinned. "I'm 8 now. That's very grown up," the nurse replied solemnly. They stopped outside a room where the door was slightly ajar. Inside, a woman lay alone, staring at the ceiling, her hands folded tightly over the blanket. Annie didn't hesitate. "Hi," she said, stepping inside. "I'm Annie." The woman turned her head, startled, then confused, then slowly curious. Daniel watched from the doorway as Annie did what she had always done best. She stayed. She asked simple questions, made small observations, offered the quiet presence that had once saved a man who didn't know he was drowning. Her mother stood beside Daniel, her hand resting lightly in his. "You see?" she whispered. She's teaching it forward. Daniel nodded. She always was. IP. That evening, back home, they sat together on the couch, Annie between them, her feet tucked beneath her head resting against Daniel's arm. Do you remember the wrong room? Annie asked suddenly. Daniel smiled. I remember. That wasn't really wrong, she said thoughtfully. No, he agreed. It wasn't. Annie yawned, her eyelids drooping. Good, she murmured. Because I don't like wrong things. Daniel carried her upstairs a few minutes later, her weight familiar, grounding. He tucked her in, adjusted the blanket, and turned off the light. Love you, she said sleepily. I love you too, he replied. Downstairs, the house settled into its evening quiet. Daniel joined his wife in the kitchen, where she stood rinsing a mug. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she replied. I want to. He smiled, recognizing the echo of his own words from long ago. They stepped outside together, the night cool and calm. Fireflies flickered faintly in the garden, small sparks of light refusing to disappear. Do you ever think about that day? She asked. The first one. Every day, Daniel said. Do you? Yes, she replied. I think about how close I was to letting go. Daniel took her hand. I think about how close I was to never opening that door. They stood there quietly. The weight of all that might have been pressing softly against what was. I was ready to die, she said. And then a little girl walked in and decided I wasn't allowed to. Daniel smiled. She's very persuasive. She gave me a reason, she continued. Not just to fight, but to belong. Daniel squeezed her hand. She gave me one too. Upstairs, Annie slept peacefully, unaware of the way her small, stubborn heart had rewritten the lives around her. Years earlier, Daniel had believed success was measured by what you built, what you owned, what you left behind. Now he understood. Sometimes, the most important thing you do is open the door. Sometimes, the wrong room is exactly where you were meant to be. And sometimes, a child knows better than anyone else who deserves to be saved and who is worth staying for. The house stood quiet and full, and that was enough. This story reminds us that true wealth is not measured by what we own, but by who we choose to stand beside when life becomes fragile. Kindness does not require power, status, or certainty. Only the courage to stay when walking away would be easier. Sometimes, the smallest act of compassion, offered without judgment or expectation, can restore dignity, awaken hope, and quietly change the course of many lives. Love is not about saving someone from pain. It is about refusing to let them face it alone. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.